Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? In this video, I'm going to make a travel chessboard, another travel chessboard, but this one's going to be a little different because it's made from walnut and figured sycamore. And sycamore is a wood that I see used quite a bit in the UK, but not so much in the US, so that might be interesting. And it's a little different because it's a two-sided board, and on one side it'll have algebraic notation inlaid into the frame. If you flip the board over, it will have a three-colored logo of a hockey team engraved into the center. So let's get started. I'll start by cutting the walnut that will be used for the squares. Next, I'll cut the sycamore. This board will have 2.5-inch squares, so I've cut everything to be 21.5 inches. The sycamore is pretty wide, so I can get all the squares out of this one piece. Now I'll run everything through the jointer. The sycamore is too wide to run through my jointer, so I'll cut it into narrower pieces on my bandsaw. Now I'll cut off some of the excess thickness of the walnut because it's quite a bit thicker than the sycamore. Let me try that again. I'll run everything through the planer. I'm not going for a specific thickness, I just want everything to be the same thickness. I'll cut these pieces to be 2.5 inches wide, and then I'll do the first glue up. I'll put a caul and some clamps at each end to apply some vertical force to help keep everything flat. I really like the way this sycamore looks. I'll use my table saw sled to square up one end, and then I'll run the board along my fence to cut the 8 strips of squares. That's hard to read, but it's about 3/128ths of an inch too wide, so I'll adjust the fence and try again. The rest of the world must be laughing at us dealing in 128ths of an inch. there's that extra 1/2 inch remaining. Now I'll do the second glue up. I like to use a square at this point to make sure everything is glued up correctly. I don't normally need to do that if I have a plywood substrate that is square, but this is a travel board that will be split in half, so it is solid wood all the way through. I'm gluing both halves at the same time, but there's no glue in the middle, so it will become 2 pieces when it's unclamped. The next day I unclamped it and then coaxed the 2 halves to separate. Then I'll run it through the drum sander to remove the glue and to get everything flat. Now I'll start working on the walnut frame. I'll cut those pieces to the width that I need and then run them through the planer to get the correct thickness. I'm going to put concealed magnets inside the frame, so I'm putting marks on the edge of each piece so that I can glue them back together correctly after I've inserted the magnets. I'll cut everything to length, and then I'll use my white pen to mark the side where I'm going to cut the holes for the magnets so that I don't put them in the wrong place. I'll put two 20mm magnets into each hole, and I'll check the attraction before gluing up to make sure the polarity is correct. Now I'll run each piece through the jointer to square them up again. And then I can run them through the table saw to get the correct width. I'll also trim the ends. Next, I'll mark all the cuts that I need to make on the table saw so that I minimize the chances of a mistake. I've marked each of the miters and also where the edge banding and borders will go. I'll use my dado blade to cut grooves for the edge banding. I made it just slightly too wide, so I had to come back and clean up the center portion. Next, I'll cut some strips of curly maple that will be glued into those grooves. I'm cutting them slightly oversized, and then I'll use the drum sander to fine-tune the width so that they fit tightly into the grooves. Before putting on the frame, I need to trim the ends of the two halves of the chessboard after gluing them up. Now I'll quickly cut off the excess edge banding. Next, I'll use this jig over my table saw fence that will help me to hold the chessboard halves vertically. And then I'll run them through the table saw to cut a groove into the three outer edges where the frame will attach with a tongue and groove fitting. I cut the groove on the 3 edges and was careful not to put a groove along the edge that was marked with a piece of blue tape. And then I flipped the board around and cut again to ensure that the groove was centered. I've had these thin strips of ebony lying around for more than a year, but I finally found the perfect use for them. These will be used for the border around the playing field. So I'll cut them on the bandsaw, sand them down to the right size, and then glue them into the frame. Now I'll cut a groove for the ebony border. Since I have the ebony protruding from the surface of the frame on both sides, I don't have a flat surface to run this through the sander, so I'll put another piece of wood under the walnut so that I can get the top side flat. Now I need to cut the tongue into the frame pieces. So I'll set the dado blade height using the chessboard as a guide. Now I need to trim the ends one last time because of the ebony that I glued in. Next, I'll cut the miter joints. With all the miters cut and the dry fit looking good, I'll mark the locations of the mortises that I need to cut for the tenons that I will insert into these joints. Before I cut the mortises, I'm going to fire up the CNC router to start carving the New York Islanders logo in the center of the board. I'll start by taping the bottom of the board because I'm going to fill the logo with epoxy and I want to be prepared for any leakage. I also put tape along the inside edge of the piece so that they won't end up stuck together. I'll put down a plywood base to catch any epoxy that might leak through, and then I put down some parchment paper so that the board won't stick to the plywood. I centered the bit at the point where the squares intersected, but that wasn't the best approach because I didn't factor in the trimming that I had done at the table saw, so this caused the logo to be slightly off-center. I'll know better for next time. The logo will be 3 colors, blue, orange, and white, and I'll do the carvings for each color in that order. I had intended to put down tape before carving to prevent bleed of the colored epoxy, but I forgot to do that, so I'm just taping the surrounding area and building a little dam to contain the epoxy. This is a new container of TotalBoat Epoxy, and the newer pumps are taller than the older ones, so I'll need to adjust that shelf up a notch. I'll mix up the epoxy and add some blue coloring. I'm going to use a combination of 2 different blues to approximate the correct color. I used a heat gun to help release some of the air bubbles. And this is what it looked like the next day. So far, so good. Now I'll do the carving for the orange epoxy. And now it's the final pass for the white epoxy. The little crystals in the mica powder make the white look almost like ice, which is pretty cool. Now I need to separate the two halves, so I'll score the center of the logo and hopefully it'll come apart fairly easily. That worked pretty well, and I was surprised how little epoxy bled into the spaces where I didn't want it to go. I suspect that clamping the two pieces together during the epoxy pours had a lot to do with that. Now I'll run it through the table saw to trim off just a hair and clean up the two edges. Now I'll start carving the notation that I will inlay into the frame. While that's running, I will cut the mortises for the miter joints. Before cutting the mortises, I'm putting a piece of tape on each corner so that I have the board oriented correctly in my mortising jig. I'll make sure that the tape is facing outwards each time. I'm using a 1/4 inch straight bit to cut the mortises. Now I'll glue in the frame pieces and use sufficient clamping pressure to make sure the miters are closed up tightly. The next day, I can run everything through the drum sander. Now I'll carve the female part of the inlay, and I'll head over to the bandsaw to cut out each of the letters and numbers. After the glue has dried, I can cut off the excess maple and then run the board through the drum sander. Next, I'll drill holes into the inner edge to place a couple of 12mm magnets into each hole to hold the board together during play. The important thing when gluing in the magnets is to be absolutely sure the polarity is correct. Next, I'll use a 16th-inch roundover bit to ease all of the edges of the frame. The client wants a high gloss epoxy finish on the board, so I'll mix up some TotalBoat TableTop Epoxy. It's mixed up in a 1-to-1 ratio, so I'll just follow the measurement marks on the mixing container. This first coat is just to penetrate into the wood and seal it up, so it's just a thin coat. It took a long time to do this because it takes about 24 hours for the epoxy to dry, so I could only do one side per day. I sanded with 180 grit sandpaper between each coat. At the end of each coat, I used a heat gun to help release the bubbles. For the last coat, I wiped the surface down with denatured alcohol. Even after all that work, there are still going to be little particles that you can't avoid unless you're working in a clean room. So the epoxy needs to be sanded and then buffed back to a gloss finish. I started sanding with 320 grit and then 400 grit. Now I'm sanding with 600 grit. It's important to sand enough as you step up in grits to remove the scratch marks from the previous grit. It seems like sanding 5 passes with each grit is enough to do that. You just need to sand at an even speed as you move methodically across the board. If you notice swirl marks like this, that means something has clogged up the sandpaper and you need to stop and switch to a new piece of sandpaper. Next, I used 800 grit. Before stepping up into the finer grits, I cleaned the board with denatured alcohol to wipe off any of the old grit that was left behind. Now I'll use 1000 grit sandpaper. You can extend the life of the sandpaper a bit if you use compressed air to clean it off to prevent it from clogging up. The final grit I will use is 1500 grit. I'll wipe it down with alcohol and now it's ready for buffing. I was going to buy a buffer, but Vevor contacted me when I was halfway through this project and asked me if there were any tools I needed, so it was perfect timing and I got them to send me a car buffer. This one comes with 4 buffing pads and a wool pad. It also comes with 2 batteries. The batteries do have a charge, but I'll make sure that they are fully charged before I begin. I'll start with this turtle wax polishing compound and use the orange pad, which is the one you should start with. I'll start with a low speed just to spread the compound around, and then I turn up the speed to do the buffing. It's looking nicer already, but it's still not glossy enough. I'll move to the white pad, and I'm using Meguiar's Ultimate Polish. These are automotive products, but they work really well on polishing the epoxy. Next, I'll use the same polish, but with the black pad. You can see the difference between the buffed piece versus the piece that's sanded to 1500 grit. And then I'll finish up with some Meguiar's Carnauba wax. So I gotta ask, would you make it?